Good.
It's really great that you agreed to do this for us, Ken. We very much appreciate it.
Mm.
And,
Well, you said you
it's...
were paying me £10,000, so I'm happy.
We wish we could afford to. Unfortunately, we're not that wealthy, but it is really, really good of you to do this for us.
Yeah.
You are being, and I think I'm right in quoting someone here. I can't remember who it is. You might be able to put me right, but someone once said about you that you were probably one of the most successful Labour politicians of the late 20th century.
Oh,
You're
now
also...
that was the Tory Max Hastings, the editor of the Evening Standard. So for him to say it was quite encouraging.
Yes, it's praise indeed, because the same person, incidentally, had some very disparaging things to say about the Prime Minister, the President, and maybe
Oh,
you would
yeah,
be
he
able
has.
to,
Yeah.
you would be able to give us your views on the
Mm.
current political situation at some
Oh, yeah.
point in your talk. But I was going to go on to say that you were mayor of the Greater London Authority when Mrs. Thatcher was in her first
Yep.
term. And you were also, I believe, Mayor of London when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and you didn't really get on with him very well either in many ways. So
No,
it's
I was
really
genuine
interesting.
socialist.
Yeah, it's really interesting that we should have a politician such as yourself to come and talk to us today. So I don't want to actually bore people with my rendition of what your career has been like. I'd like you to tell us yourself, and you've prepared a talk called 38 Years of Lies and Smears.
Yeah,
So it would be very interesting to hear what you have to say. So when you're ready, Ken, please
I'm
go
ready.
ahead.
Well, let me start by saying, I mean, this current row, although I've had 39 years of lies and smears, this last 4 years, it's all been about anti-Semitism. And it's been, I mean, just about the worst of these things over the last 4 decades, because whilst I'm used to having lies and smears, I mean, all this stuff about anti-Semitism has caused genuine concern and worries amongst a big chunk of the Jewish community. I remember seeing an article in the run-up to the December election last year. I can't remember if it's the Jewish Chronicle or not, saying if Labour wins the election, Jews will have to leave Britain. And that, causing that sort of concern, is most probably much worse about all of this than any damage done to me or Jeremy Corbyn. But anyhow, let me start about how it all got going. I mean, when Jeremy became Labour leader, the vast majority of Labour MPs and the Labour bureaucracy were assuming it'd be a disaster. But I was one of the very few Labour people doing interviews saying Jeremy can win the next election. And therefore, a lot of Labour MPs were furious and wanted to get rid of me. And it all really erupted just on the 28th of April, 2016. I'd done an interview that morning at about 9 o'clock on BBC Radio. And I'd been asked, in the middle of a debate about Jeremy Corbyn, suddenly I'm asked, is what Hitler did illegal? And I just thought, I mean, this has no relevance to a discussion about our current politics in Britain. And I simply dismissed it in a few words. I said, well, in the 1930s, Hitler supported Zionism. Then he went mad and killed 6 million Jews. And I was just referring to the fact that in the summer of 1933, the German Zionists and the Nazi government signed an agreement. Now, this wasn't because they liked each other, but when Hitler came to power, over 500,000 Germans were Jewish, and the Nazis wanted them out. And of course, the German Zionist movement had been campaigning for decades for the right of Jews to return to their ancient homeland of Palestine. So after that deal was signed, over the next 6 years, the Nazi government and the German Zionists, working together, migrated 60,000 of Germany's Jews to the then British colony of Palestine. As I said, it wasn't because they liked each other, but they had a shared understanding. And if the German Zionists hadn't done that deal with the Nazis, those 60,000 Jews would have followed the other 6 million to the gas chamber. So it was an important deal. They should have done it. And so that's what I said. Over the next 3 hours, no journalist contacted me to ask about what I'd said. But then I turned up to do another interview, and as the then Labour MP, John Mann, of course, he left the Labour Party now, and the Tories have appointed him to the House of Lords. And he's got a television crew in tow, and he starts shouting in my face that I'm a Nazi apologist. Then he launches this big lie that I'd said Hitler was a Zionist. And this went global, because an hour later, the General Secretary of the Labour Party, Ian McNichol, announces I've been suspended. He doesn't pick up the phone to say, did you say Hitler was a Zionist or anything like that? And now we know, with all the leaked documents, that he was completely disloyal to the Labour leadership at the time. And so suddenly my suspension and the television coverage of this Labour MP screaming I'm a Nazi apologist goes global all the way around the world. And literally over the next few hours, the next couple of days, all my meetings around the world are cancelled, and broadly, it was like a wall came down. And what I found amazing was that not a single radio or television channel, although this was the lead item on the news that day, not a single radio or television news channel invited me on to ask had I had said Hitler was a Zionist. And what I found really equally annoying was that, given this dominated news, no paper investigated my record. When I was elected Mayor of London, my first decision was to appoint a Jewish woman as my deputy, and we worked together well for 8 years. The 8 years that I was mayor, anti-Semitic incidents recorded by the Metropolitan Police went down by 50%. This was because when I became mayor, I had a meeting with the board of deputies of British Jews. We agreed a campaign to tackle anti-Semitism, and it had an immediate effect. When Boris Johnson took over, under his 8 years, anti-Semitic incidents recorded by the police doubled because he didn't carry on with my policy. Whereas I spent much of those 8 years promoting tolerance between the different communities in London. I didn't just defend the Jewish community, I defended the Hindus, the Muslims, Roman Catholics. And it just seems to me that's a key part of what you should be doing in politics. Anyhow, if I had been anti-Semitic, it wasn't just how do you explain that reduction in anti-Semitic incidents in London? It's also, why did Israel invite me on back in 1986 on a proper tour of the State of Israel, arranging meetings all over the place and so on. So there we go. What I find interesting was, of course, immediately those people trying to get rid of Jeremy referred this to the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, who've been investigating it ever since. And they'll be publishing their report in about a month or so. But what I find amazing, because they sent me a copy of the report as it applies to me, although that John Mann incident dominated the news and led to my suspension and was the biggest news event about anti-Semitism over the last 4 years, they don't mention it at all. There's not a single sentence, because were the Human Rights and Equalities Commission to actually really analyse this, it would show that anti-Semitism claims were being used to undermine Jeremy, and there was no truth behind any of them. And you see, this is what it was all about. Jeremy Corbyn was the first socialist leader Labour had since Michael Foot back in the early 1980s. And the financial and corporate establishment in Britain just assumed he was a complete disaster and would do as badly as Michael Foot did in the 1983 election. And I think that what then traumatised them, when we had the general election in 2017, under Jeremy Corbyn, Labour achieved the biggest rise in its vote for 72 years. We surged up to 40%, just 2% behind the Tories. And the real thing is that if over the previous 18 months, Labour MPs and the Labour bureaucracy had supported Jeremy, been promoting his policies, his economic and social agenda, I think we would have won that election. But there we are. We can never be quite certain about that. But Jeremy, having come so close in 2017, suddenly the establishment's attacks on Jeremy and his shadow chancellor, John McDonnell, massively accelerated, because they knew if Jeremy was to win the next election, and with John McDonnell as chancellor, they had made it absolutely clear they were going to crack down on all the tax dodging and money laundering, which is, absolutely widespread in Britain's financial institutions. And so that was what it's all about. They were terrified they'd be made to pay their full share of tax, and Jeremy and John McDonnell made it absolutely clear that that was going to be the case. And therefore, I think that's what really fed all this stuff about anti-Semitism, because here we are, over 4.5 years on, and you've still not got any serious evidence of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, because if you're anti-Semitic, you weren't going to join the Labour Party. I mean, the Labour Party had been a home for the Jewish community for decades. I mean, I remember when I came into politics, I think there were only 2 Conservative MPs who were Jewish, but there were dozens on the Labour benches and on local councils and so on. I mean, the Labour Party had been a natural home for the Jewish community, because we defended all minority groups who are abused, not just Jews, but blacks and Asians, and back during the days of the IRA, the Roman Catholic community, who were getting a lot of abuse as well. So, I mean, that was, I think, what defined that row about anti-Semitism. You see, that's just the recent thing. I mean, all this started for me back in 1981, on the day I became the leader of the Greater London Council. Now, that evening, Thatcher made a speech to the Scottish Conservatives saying that my plan was to impose on Britain a communist tyranny like those of Eastern Europe. Now, the idea that cutting bus and tube fares was going to spark a commie revolution was a bit bonkers. But until Thatcher made that speech, no GLC leader had ever been a national political figure. I doubt if 1% of people would have known the name of the GLC leader. No GLC leader had ever had a press officer, because the national press never wanted to interview you or anything. There'd just been occasional mention every few months in the London evening papers. But from the moment Thatcher made that speech, every Tory supporting newspaper allocated a reporter full-time to County Hall. The Daily Mail brought their war correspondent back from the Middle East and told him he had to file 6 stories a day, which put him under massive pressure, and I think was a factor which led to his relatively early death. But it was unbelievable. Within days, I mean, the Tory press was implying that I was a commie agent, broadly supporting the Soviet Union. I was supporting the IRA's bombing campaign. I was going to be a disaster. And of course, a lot of people believed this because it dominated the news. And in the 6 months after Thatcher made that speech, I was physically assaulted 3 times on the streets. 2 men from a far-right group sprayed red paint over me, and another couple of occasions people took a swing at me and so on. But it all began to change, of course, when I cut the fares, and that became, it was a 33% cut in our bus and tube fares, massive news. And then, of course, the law lords ruled it was illegal to cut fares, which was absolutely bizarre. So that started to dominate the news, and suddenly I'm being invited onto programs like Question Time, TV Question Time, the BBC's Radio Any Questions. And so I remember after the first appearance on Any Questions, the BBC got all these letters from people saying it's amazing, I agreed with what he said, whereas they'd all, of course, thought I was a commie agent and were stunned by I was broadly saying things I agreed with. But Thatcher making that speech had a huge impact. There were more stories about me in the press than any other politician except Thatcher. And of course, that caused a lot of anger on Labour's front bench, because there's all these, long-standing Labour MPs, the shadow cabinet members, and they're pulled to see this working class oik from South London who was just a councillor, getting more coverage in the news than they were. But it went on and on. But gradually people formed an opinion, and 18 months after I became GLC leader, I won the second place in the BBC's annual Man of the Year poll. I came second to the Pope, which was quite unusual. But you see, although it has happened to me, it's been the norm in politics in the Western democracies. I mean, if you just look back, we've been lied to consistently by the establishment across Europe, across North America, and gradually the truth comes out. I mean, if you go back to the end of the Second World War, Roosevelt, just before he died, was putting together a deal with Stalin. So, and literally just days before he died, he sent a telegram to Churchill, who was still Prime Minister, saying, we can work with Stalin. And Stalin was negotiating to borrow $6 billion from America to rebuild Russia's economy that had been destroyed by the German invasion. But immediately, when Truman came to power, he launched the Cold War. And I think the main reason for that was by then, the American economy was 48% of the global economy, and nothing ever predominant like that. But such a vast amount of it was caught up in military production, weapons, and so on. And so if we'd gone from the Cold War to a peaceful deal with the Soviet Union, millions of American jobs would have been wiped out, as they'd have closed down their military armaments producing firms and things like that. And so the Cold War was stoked up, I think, quite deliberately by Truman. And I grew up in this post-war world where we're told Russia was a real threat. We lived with the fear of war. But, literally, when Kennedy was elected president in 1960, and that's the first American election I remember, one of his pledges to the American people was to close the missile gap with the Soviet Union. And when he gets his first briefing from the Pentagon, they said, well, don't worry. Russia has 4 nuclear missiles that can reach America. We have 350 that can meet the Soviet Union. And so, yet, here's a man who'd been a senator for 8 years, on the verge of being president, and had to live with all these lies just like the rest of us had done, because that's what the establishment wanted. And anyone who's a challenge to that gets an awful lot of abuse. I mean, we just have to look at what's been happening in America over the last couple of years. The lies and smears about Bernie Sanders depicted as though he's going to impose a communist tyranny. And even now, when the Democratic candidate is Joe Biden, who's been on the right wing of the Democratic Party all his life, he's voted to support every one of America's wars in the Middle East. And now he's being depicted as a socialist threat to the United States of America. And it isn't just about the Cold War. All over Latin America, whenever you had a democratically elected socialist government, it was overthrown with the support of the CIA, whether it was in Venezuela, Nicaragua, whatever. America had this huge economic interest in Latin America, and you had all these ghastly little right-wing dictators who were serving America's corporate interests. And when any of them was defeated or overthrown, America moved in to reverse that as rapidly as possible. And literally, the lies you still read today about Venezuela, about what a disaster it's been. But I went to Venezuela just after I lost the mayoralty in 2008. And Chavez had actually made a transformation. When he came to power, he took control of the oil industry. Instead of the profits all going to American corporations, the money was used to create full employment, a health service for people, and it transformed their lives. Now, today we're told the Venezuelan economy is in a crisis. Well, yes, it is, because for over a decade, America has imposed sanctions, just as they've done with Cuba for over 60 years, just as they're doing with Iran. And the consequence of America's economic sanctions on these countries is a real assault on the lives of ordinary people in those countries, being denied the quality of life, the food, the medicines that they actually need. So this has all been about America sustaining its domination of the world. So what should we do about this? I mean, if we look at Boris now, he's most probably the most unpredictable Conservative leader of my lifetime, if not in all Conservative history. And faced with this coronavirus crisis, he's suddenly ramped up spending in a way that no previous Tory government has done over the last 40 years. And I suppose what depressed me most about the general election last December was having ramped up all the anti-Semitism stuff. That dominated the election. Whereas in 2017, Jeremy's policies about increasing investment, building our economy, increasing public services had been a big factor in that huge rise in the Labour vote. But now it was squeezed off the media agenda, and it was barely mentioned. And that's why I think Labour did so badly at that election. So we've got to get across to people the truth. We've been lied to not just about foreign policy, but about the economy and everything else ever since Thatcher and Reagan came to power. And if you actually look, the Labour government in 1945 created the fairest economic and social system that we'd had in Britain ever. We created a welfare state, the National Health Service, full employment, a big increase in our investment. And when the Tories came back to power in 1951, they carried on with those policies. In the 1959 election, their campaign slogan was "You've never had it so good," and that was true. In those first years of my life, I grew up in a world where things were getting better every year. Council housing was being built. When I left school, every boy got a job. Literally, I didn't meet an unemployed person until I was 28, and that was the legacy of that, the social and economic policies of that post-war Labour government. And of course, the same thing was happening in America. Roosevelt's policies, when he came to power in 1933, brought an end to the Great Depression and laid the foundation for a really improving world in America. Not as good and as fair as we were having in Britain, but still very good. But then, when Thatcher became the leader of the Tory party, it coincided with the war in the Middle East that fueled the massive increase in oil prices. And at the end of 1973 and early 1974, the Arab nations increased the price of oil by 400%, triggered the worst recession we'd seen since the 1930s. And it had the same impact, of course, in the United States of America. And Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were saying, we're in this mess because we've been spending too much. We've got to cut public spending. And none of this was true. It's a completely dishonest lie. And that agenda dominated politics throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s. And when Clinton came to office, he broadly carried on with those policies. He actually, in 1998, repealed Roosevelt's controls and regulations of the financial sector, which led to the economic crash in 2008. And of course, Thatcher had done the same thing here in Britain in 1986 with legislation that repealed controls here. And so we've got to get across to people. If we want to live in a secure and improving world, we've got to get back to those policies of a fairer tax system, government intervention, and to ensure we get good levels of investment. And if we do all that, I think we can actually persuade people, and we could see the election of a really good progressive government. And so that's what I would say to all my successors who are now in the Labour Party, generations younger than me. Don't try and simply echo the lies and smears of the right wing. Stand up and challenge them and reach out to people and lay the foundation that can bring a progressive Labour government to power. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ken. I'd just like to say to people that are tuning in that they can ask a question by typing into the Q&A section on the right of the screen. Ken, could I start by just asking you to kind of extrapolate a little bit of your views on the current situation? If you had been fortunate enough to be in the mayoralty, let's say, of London, how would you have handled the situation vis-a-vis the COVID crisis, and what are your views on the way the government's handled the COVID situation?
Well, you just have to compare us with Germany. Germany brought in its lockdown weeks before we did. I mean, the German Chancellor, which is a Conservative, much more rational and on top of data and so on. Whereas the problem with Boris Johnson, I don't really see Boris Johnson as a politician. I think he just wants to be a celebrity. He wants to be famous. Virtually every day on television, he's promoting himself, popping up somewhere all over the country in farms, schools or whatever. I think you need to be in Downing Street running the country, not promoting yourself all around it. And in the 8 years he was mayor, he virtually did nothing, about the only thing he actually did. He built the cable car to nowhere, which has just been a disaster and a huge loss of money. Whereas when I was mayor, I came into politics to run things, not be a celebrity. And as I say, when I became leader of the GLC, we'd never had a press officer. You just gone on, you built council housing, you improved the public transport system. But Boris Johnson, it's just about promoting himself. And he wouldn't have sat down, with the start of the COVID outbreak, he wouldn't have had early meetings with scientists working out what to do and moving ahead. He was about the last leader to actually respond to it in Europe. And that's why we've had, I think, 2-4 times as many deaths as the Germans have had.
Right. Given your sort of explanation of the last 30 odd years, and what you were talking about really, I suppose, comes under the broad heading of neoliberalism. You were very prominent at the time when this new economic thinking was being implemented in Britain in the early 1980s. I'm a little bit younger than you, so I was younger at the time, but I do remember it really quite well. And you did mention the issue about employment and how I grew up also at a time where full employment was considered to be a very desirable thing, but very suddenly we had large numbers of people unemployed, didn't we? I wonder if you could sort of give us your views a little bit more about those early days of Thatcherism and really what it was like in London at the time.
Well, because Thatcher started her campaign to abolish the GLC, that dominated my political activity in the early 1980s. We were campaigning against all of that. Once the GLC had been abolished in 1986, I'd been selected as a candidate for Parliament. I got elected a year later. I decided to focus on economic policy. So I employed a brilliant lefty economist, John Ross, to give me advice on all this. And in 1989, we started producing a monthly journal called Socialist Economic Bulletin. I'd spent £25,000 to buy a computer, because back in those days they were incredibly expensive, and all the money I earned from media stuff went into paying that off over about 5 or 6 years. And we'd analysed data, and you can still access this. It's a website now, and 40 years on, it's still producing a proper analysis of that challenges all the neoliberal nonsense. Because literally, if you look at the 30 years before Thatcher came to power, We had higher levels of investment and a higher rate of growth in our economy than we've had in the 40 years since. The same is true in the United States of America. But you never see a serious analysis of this. When Thatcher stepped down, the Panorama program produced a documentary about her economic record. But the leadership of the boss of the BBC refused to allow it to be shown, so no one ever saw it. So we've grown up being told, Thatcher and Reagan, they transformed the economy and made it dramatically better. But you only have to do a little bit of access to my old Socialist Economic Bulletin, and you can see no, they never achieved the levels of growth and investment that were defined by that post-war, much more consensual politics.
So take us a little bit further forward and to the 90s and the transformation that went on in the Labour Party itself. What are your views about the way in which Tony Blair changed the Labour Party in the 90s?
Well, you see, I don't think Tony Blair was naturally a Labour supporter. When he was at Oxford University, he never went to a single political event. He had no interest in it at all. It was only when he started work as a lawyer and fell in love with the woman he then went on to marry. And she was totally caught up in the Labour Party. And I think that's the only reason he got involved in it. And he actually was interviewed a few years ago. And he said, I thought it was my job to build on what Thatcher had achieved, not to roll it back. Well, if he told us that when he was running for the Labour leadership back in 1994, he wouldn't have got it. And it was a tragedy because he did broadly carry it on. And we did some good things, legalised gay and lesbian relationships. And on some social issues, he was very much better, but he never challenged the economic policies of the Thatcher legacy. And so we've carried on. And here we see today, every time new data comes out, the number of poor people is growing year by year by year. And this is the legacy of Thatcher that Blair carried on with. And I just think it was a tragedy that John Smith died, because although John Smith was on the right of the Labour Party, he would have taken a much more serious rebalancing of the British economy. He understood the needs of working class people. And his death was an absolute tragedy. We'd be living in a much better world now if he hadn't died.
Do you think that the Labour Party is going to survive, Ken?
Oh yes, literally. I think Keir Starmer, a bit like John Smith, although on the right of the party, comes over as a credible potential prime minister. And one of the interesting things, as soon as he got the Labour nomination to stand for Holborn, one of the first things he did was come up to my home and have a nice long chat about what he could do as an MP and got my advice on things. So I do think he's generally Labour. And, I will have not the slightest hesitation in being out there campaigning for him when the next election comes.
So, but the situation within the party at the moment is still riven by this question that you started your talk with over anti-Semitism, isn't it? Do you not think that there are serious problems within the party itself at the moment that might damage it in some ways? No,
I think in a sense Keir Starmer has sort of clamped down on that. And it's going to be very hard for people to stoke up accusations of anti-Semitism under Keir Starmer, because he's been very firm on all of this. But also here we are, 5 years on since all these allegations started, but where do you ever see any detailed account of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party? On the day I was suspended, in those interviews I was doing, I said, all my time in the Labour Party, I'd never heard or seen anything anti-Semitic. I was only one occasion when I heard a racist comment. Back in 1970, a white man in the Nord Labour Party was ranting on about the song Young, Gifted and Black. That was it. And that week, 80 Jewish Labour Party members published a letter in The Guardian saying in all their hundreds of years in the party, none of them had ever seen or heard a single anti-Semitic incident. And one of my oldest friends, a 90-year-old, he's Jewish, he's been in the Labour Party longer than me, he remembers one instance when decades ago someone made a coarse joke about Jews and money. That's it. And so literally, as I said earlier, if you're anti-Semitic, you're not going to join the Labour Party. You'll get caught up either in the Tory Party or Nigel Farage's party.
Quite. So, do you think that currently the government, although it has this large majority, do you think that there is a chance that the government may be removed or fall before the end of its term?
Well, there's an 80-seat majority, so it's hard to imagine that. But the chaos inside the Tory party at the moment is such that it is a possibility. But I think, as Keir Starmer's poll ratings keep rising, there will be just hanging on. So I think we could have it. They could hang on in for the whole 4 years, however much of a mess they're actually making of things.
Right.
We have a very bad system. It's very difficult to get rid of a bad government as long as it's got a majority.
I mean, do you think though that when you say chaos, that's quite a strong word to use? Could you kind of give us your views about what the current situation is vis-a-vis the government and the way it's operating?
Well, it's quite interesting because you had these lot of traditional Labour seats electing Tory MPs in December, and I think a lot of them realise if they want to keep their seat, they've got to do some things to improve the quality of life for people and making sure there are jobs and things like that. So there's a potential for a real split in the Labour Party and in the Tory Party. But also, Boris doesn't have an ideology. I mean, he responds to each crisis as it erupts. When I became Mayor of London, we drew up a 20-year plan for the development of London. Boris has never done that. When he was Mayor, he's not done it for Britain now. Boris just responds as events erupt, and that's disastrous. I mean, good governments have to have a long-term strategy.
Quite. And what are your thoughts about the cabinet?
This is the most mediocre cabinet of my lifetime. I mean, there's so many of them are useless. I mean, literally, our politics. I think politics. A lot of it around the world is getting worse. You look at Brazil with the election of someone like Bolsonaro, a climate change denier. I mean, you look at Trump, another climate change denier. I really worry that, we're heading towards extinction by the end of this century because we need to be taking urgent action now to tackle climate change. And tackling climate change would create millions of new jobs in a green economy and make a much better quality of life. But, very few, some of the Scandinavian governments are doing quite well on that. But, Britain and America, absolutely hopeless.
Just turning to America, what about the current situation there vis-a-vis the politics? I mean, we've been debating within the politics department for some time now about whether it's possible to predict the outcome of the election in the United States. What are your views? Do you think that Trump could actually get back in again?
Well, you've got to. It's not since. I'm trying to think. 1992 was the last time a sitting president didn't get re-elected. That was George Bush the first. So it's not normal. But Trump's well behind in the polls, and I think he comes over as pretty chaotic. And I think Joe Biden, although I don't agree with him, I think he's far too much on the right wing of the Democratic Party. He does come over as much more credible. If I had to, bet money today, I'd bet on Biden winning. But of course, it could be quite close. But if Trump gets another 4 years, it will be a disaster for America.
In what way?
Oh, just the economic mess. I mean, and the failure to tackle climate change. I mean, don't forget, Trump is just like Boris Johnson. It's about promoting himself. It's about being a famous celebrity. And, literally, I mean, as I say, when I got onto Lambeth Council the first time I was elected to anything back in 1971, I followed John Major on. And John Major, who became our Prime Minister in 1990, I think it was 1989 or 1990. He came into politics just like I did. It was to build more he was building more council homes than the previous Labour administration had done. That was the politics that dominated Labour and Tory parties. Now it's all these people. They just want to be famous. It's awful.
Right. So this is a pretty damning indictment of the current situation. I mean, one of the things that I teach is political communication, and this is about the relationship between the electorate and the politicians and the way the media works. I mean, a lot of what you've talked about is about the way the media is intervening in politics in a big way and seems to be dictating these things, and the tendency for people to be celebrities and celebrities being effective as political agents, if you like, rather than politicians, is quite marked, isn't it? And I agree with you. I agree with you to a great extent. There. But you've as a personality yourself, I mean, you've actually been very successful as a politician in winning elections. And I just wondered whether you had any kind of advice for people who might be setting about campaigning. What do you think makes a successful campaign?
Well, I think getting across policies that people can identify with. I mean, when I won the GLC election in 1981, we were promising to rebuild our public transport system, cut the fares. I mean, when I was elected mayor in 2000, it was a whole load of really detailed policies. But also, still today, every day, someone stops me on the streets and says, "Thank you for what you did," or "Please run for mayor again," or whatever. And so I think you must come into politics to do things, and that is, absolutely wonderful. And not to be a celebrity, and that's what I was about. I spent my time studying what you could do, how people use the powers you'd got, and how you can improve people's lives. And people saw I did that. The trouble is, when we got to the 2008 election, Labour became deeply unpopular, and just a few days before the election, Gordon Brown had introduced a tax change so that the 6 million lowest paid people in Britain suddenly saw their tax double, and the Labour vote went off a cliff. And that was, I think, the biggest factor in my losing.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
It wouldn't have affected you because you weren't one of the lowest paid people, but literally, the poorest people were paying 20% tax on their income, and suddenly it went to 40%. And you can imagine the effect of that. And that was, just literally about 2 weeks before the election. And the Labour vote in the polls just slumped.
Right.
And I say, I got a real problem now. I'm losing my voice. It's all croaking. So
yeah, well, we've come to the end of our time, really, Ken. And it's been fascinating listening to you. And like I said, we're really grateful to you for your time. We have recorded this, and if you don't mind, we would like to make it available to people to listen to if they want to.
Yeah, do it.
And maybe if you've got the energy and the voice, you could come back next year, and we'll have another chat about what's happened between now and then. How about that?
I'd love to do that next year. But don't worry, I'm 75. As long as I'm still alive, I'll be happy to do it. Let's hope by then we can do it at a public meeting. I love that connection with people.
Thank you, Ken. And so do we. And we're hoping for the best. Okay?
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you very much indeed.